Hey guys, Shalon here. Welcome to the Bin Zone. On today's video, we are ranking every Targaryen king that we've seen on screen. So we're focusing mainly on all the Targaryen kings and their heirs that we've seen in House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, and we're even including some that were mentioned in flashbacks. Because if we rank every Targaryen king and their heir, we'd be here a while. And the only way to truly rank these characters is to rank them against the gold standard first S tier on this list, Aegon the Conqueror. He is what it means to be a Targaryen. This man flew to Westeros on the biggest dragon in history, Balerion, with his two wives.
You're already wed.
That didn't stop Aegon the Conqueror from taking a second wife.
Yes, his two wives. He was married to both of them at the same time. Conquered 6 of the 7 kingdoms, subjugated them, and created the Targaryen dynasty that lasted 300 years. He is what it means to be a Targaryen. He is the gold standard. He left Westeros better than he found it. He made the House of the Dragon strong, and he had 2 wives. The only thing that could make Aegon the Conqueror a super god is if those wives weren't his sister. I mean, we all can't be perfect. But now that we have our first S tier and the gold standard that everyone is competing against, Aegon the Conqueror, let's begin. And the first king we're introduced to is old King Jaehaerys. Now, Jaehaerys is the longest reigning king in Westerosi history because he reigned for 60 years and 60 years of peace. Once he took the throne from his uncle Maegor, he reigned over the most peaceful and prosperous era in the 7 kingdoms. And that's pretty much where all the praise stops, because old King Jaehaerys is arguably the main reason why the House of the Dragon came crumbling apart, and ultimately what caused the destruction of the Targaryen dynasty. You see, Jaehaerys and his 60 years of rule had over 10 kids. However, when it came down for him to succeed the throne, he had none of those kids available to take the throne, and that created a succession crisis. That's what we see in the beginning scenes of House of the Dragon, and that's pretty much the catalyst that causes everything that went down in House of the Dragon and created the Dance of the Dragon. Because he had no direct son heir, some of his kids would rather run away to Essos, work at a pleasure house, and give birth to bastards than be around Jaehaerys. I can't rank him any higher than a C. He had the most peaceful reign, he had the longest reign, but he could single-handedly be responsible for the destruction of the Targaryen dynasty. So when you weigh it off, Westeros is better for it, but the Targaryens as a whole were worse off with Jaehaerys. Speaking of succession crisis, had he went with the eldest child of his eldest son, it would have been Rhaenys, the queen that never was, and essentially the Dance of the Dragons would have never had an issue. But because he let his advisors, aka Otto Hightower, convince him to hold an election, Viserys became the next king. And King Viserys I is going straight to C tier. Because I can't fully blame him for everything that went down in House of the Dragon, only because Jaehaerys was the catalyst for everything. Viserys did the best that he could with what he had. Even though he himself had 2 heirs, his brother Daemon and then officially Rhaenyra, his firstborn son Aegon ends up being a usurper. So essentially Viserys, while also ruling over a peaceful Westeros, left the House of the Dragons ever more divided. And because of that, and essentially his weak rule and him isolating Daemon, he can't be any higher than C tier. Speaking of Daemon, he's on here not only because he's an heir, but because Daemon is technically the king.
What would you call the husband of the queen?
Well, the king.
There it is then.
Consort.
That last bit seems unnecessary, don't you think?
Granted, not the king of the Iron Throne, he's the king consort. He's still a king. And with that being said, I'm putting Daemon at A tier. Now, hear me out. Daemon would have been the perfect Targaryen king. Daemon was not as cruel as Maegor, and at the same time, Daemon was not as soft as his brother Viserys or Jaehaerys. He was more even-handed, I feel like, and he perfectly represented what it meant to be Targaryen. Even in Westerosi society, my man still practices old Valyrian traditions. He loves to speak High Valyrian. He has the best bond with his dragon, and he wants to marry his niece. Like, even when he had a wife, he wanted to intermarry in the Targaryen bloodline and ended up marrying a Valyrian, which is what Viserys could have done instead of marrying his sister's best friend, but that's neither here nor there. On top of Daemon's charming characteristics, it's ultimately his bloodline that succeeds in the Iron Throne and continues the Targaryen legacy, so he has to go up in A. And during the Dance of the Dragons, He was the sole reason Rhaenyra was winning and sat on the Iron Throne. And I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I could talk on and on about Daemon, but he's a solid A tier. Now for Viserys' actual heir.
You are the true queen, Rhaenyra. First of her name, protector of the realm.
Rhaenyra Targaryen. I'm gonna put Rhaenyra on the B tier because Rhaenyra was the rightful queen. She should have sat on the Iron Throne, but Rhaenyra can't go any higher only because while she was bred from childhood to be a good queen, and she was, even as the Dance of the Dragon started, it was frustrating watching Rhaenyra show restraint after they killed her son, after they killed Rhaenys. She is too even-handed, but that is something she learned from her father. That is something that helps the kingdom. And ultimately, Rhaenyra had like 10 kids. No, no, she didn't have 10. Rhaenyra had like 6 kids, spreading the Targaryen dynasty. Rhaenyra was popping them out left and right, making sure there were little Targaryens running around everywhere. And they were all legitimate, even though some were bastards. Unlike the other Targaryens, Rhaenyra as a woman had to claim her kids. So not only that, she helped spread House Targaryen around, and her having all those kids kind of paid off at the end of House of the Dragons. It's because she had so many kids that her and Daemon kids sit on the Iron Throne.
Rather feed my sons to the dragons than have them carry shields and caps.
Rhaenyra also ruling over the kingdom, even though her rule was brief and it ended terribly. And she also proliferated House Targaryen, all the kids she had. But now let's talk about Viserys' other heir, the one that he did not name heir, but ended up usurping the throne. We're talking Aegon Targaryen, the second of his name. Aegon, just going straight to D tier. Aegon, let's call a spade. He was a terrible king. He was never supposed to be king. They kind of threw it in his lap and he did the best that he could with what he had. His rule was terrible. The people were starving. He was killing rat catchers. His heir died. He could not have any kids. He lost his first dragon battle. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But he did sit on the Iron Throne. He did rule over a short time of peace, and let's be honest, Aegon would have had way more kids had Aemon not cooked them.
Is the heir to the throne bothering you, Tyler?
Speaking of kids, Aegon's heir, Jaehaerys, young Prince Jaehaerys, had to make the list, and he's a straight F tier. My man's never sat on the Iron Throne. I don't even think my man saw the age of 5 years old. Daemon had blood and cheese take him out, and that's another reason Daemon's so high on the list. Even though he's a kinslayer and killed a Targaryen, it was retribution for Aemon Targaryen, and he also took out the heir to Aegon, making sure that his line was the only line of Targaryen kids to rule. When I tell you I could go on and on about Daemon, I really could. And with young Jaehaerys being dead, the next king on the list, or Lord Protector and Regent, is Aemon Targaryen. He's running the kingdom while Aegon is recovering. He was the one left in charge, so for all intents and purposes, he was the king at the time. And let's just put it right here. He's an F tier. He might have been one of the worst kings ever. Let's talk about everything he did wrong. On top of just being a terrible, mean king, he killed the most Targaryens during the Dance of the Dragons. Instead of expanding their dynasty, he caused the most deaths. He killed an honorary Targaryen in Luke Valerion. He killed Rhaenys Targaryen. And ultimately, him and Daemon's final battle caused him to kill one of the greatest Targaryen princes that ever lived. So he goes straight to an F tier. If not for Rhaegar, he wouldn't even make the list, but he was king, it's only fair. But his rule was terrible and the proliferation of his family was non-existent. Speaking of non-existent, I want to throw in a special character here. He was the legal heir to Rhaenyra. We're talking Jace Valerion, aka Jace Targaryen. If he ever sat on the Iron Throne, Viserys decreed that his last name would go from Valerion to Targaryen. So he's technically a Targaryen, and he was technically heir to the Iron Throne. He should have been king because he was Rhaenyra's oldest child. But he's a D tier for a reason. He's a great guy, raised right, had a dragon, everything that he needed to be a great Targaryen king, except for his very strong brown features. And the fact that he doesn't even survive the Dance of the Dragons. So he's a D tier. He would have been an F, but I feel like he's a little better than Aemon and Jaehaerys at least. The next king on the list is King Aegon the Third, another Aegon. And this Aegon is the son to Rhaenyra and Daemon. He's gonna go to the D tier. Aegon essentially inherits the Iron Throne after the Dance of the Dragons, but because of all the trauma he suffered during the dance, watching dragons kill people, he became scared of dragons, never tamed a dragon, and the last Targaryen dragon died under his rule. And that's just, without dragons, Targaryens really don't have any basis for their power. So ultimately, It started with King Jaehaerys, ended with Aegon, and because of that, he's a D tier. Granted, the time he was king was somewhat peaceful because people were tired of the war between his mom and his uncle, so he became king and it was a peaceful time. And essentially when he passed on, his brother Viserys II became king. He's the other kid in the picture. You probably can't see him, but he's the other kid off onto the side. So Daemon and Rhaenyra have 2 kids who sit on the Iron Throne. And that's another reason Daemon's so high on the list. But even with both brothers combined, they extended House Targaryen, but they didn't do much to make it better. Actually, Aegon held Viserys from being a C tier. Now we're about to fast forward to the Game of Thrones timeline. But before we go there, I want to take a second to talk about a specific Targaryen that we've been talking about throughout this video, and that's Maegor Targaryen. Maegor, I'm just going to go ahead and put him a C tier. They call Maegor the Cruel, but Maegor was the sole reason House Targaryen survived, and he was the first one to take on the Faith Militant. Way before Cersei ever thought about blowing the sept, Maegor did it first with Balerion. Granted, he usurped the throne from his nephew, but he ended up giving it back to his other nephew, if you count Jaehaerys. And even though he was cruel to the realm, and the realm was in constant fighting, he tried his best to establish House Targaryen's dynasty, and he held the kingdom together. Because after Aegon died, Aegon's firstborn son Aenys, Maegor's older brother, was a terrible weak king. So once he died, Maegor took over and usurped his brother's kids, and he held the kingdom together and held Targaryen power. Using Balerion to destroy some of the kingdoms, he made sure their power and their rule lasted for as long as he did. So because of that, he's going on the C tier, honorary mention, Maegor the Cruel. Just think of Maegor as a way more extreme Daemon. And technically, Maegor is the one who created the curse of the second son, being Aegon the Conqueror's second son. Jesus, I've said Aegon so many times. That's just 3 Aegons on this list. Could you imagine if I counted all the Aegons House Targaryen has? Woo. But now we find ourselves in the Game of Thrones timeline, and I'm just gonna go ahead and put the Mad King as an F. Let's be realistic. He was the final straw that broke the camel's back, destroyed House Targaryen. You know what? I'm gonna put him on a D because if not for him, we would not have Game of Thrones. We would not have Ned Stark, Robert Baratheon, and a great story. So technically, he destroyed House Targaryen, but because he gave us a great story, I'm gonna move him up to D. He's at least better than Aemon. But overall, he's a terrible king. Even though he was up to a bunch of fuck shit, he had enough kids to proliferate the house. And because he had so much kids, House Targaryen survived. And I can't be mad at that. D tier. But let's talk about his heir, Rhaegar Targaryen. I'm gonna go ahead and put Rhaegar right here as a C tier. Rhaegar did cause the war. He did kidnap Lyanna Stark or run away from her. Whatever you want to believe, your story's totally up to you. He started the war that caused the kingdom to collapse. Granted, his father didn't help, but he was already married. He was obsessed with Aegon. He already had a wife and he wanted another one. He wanted 2 wives. He wanted the Song of Ice and Fire to be about him, and ultimately his hubris caused the downfall of House Targaryen. But the realm loved him, the people loved him, and the only people who actually rebelled was people that him and his father directly affected. The Starks and the Baratheons, as well as the Aarons. So technically the realm loved him, and he had a lot of kids. He gave us Jon Snow, so he's gonna go up there and see. But now let's talk about one of the more interesting characters, and that is Viserys Targaryen, the Beggar King. I know towards the end of his time in Game of Thrones, he was despicable, but before we got there, he was a good kid who protected and raised Daenerys. It wasn't until the tragedy and trauma of selling his mom's crown and essentially becoming the Beggar King that his spirit broke and he became mean and nasty. Up until then, he wanted to marry Daenerys and rule the 7 kingdoms together. He was a nice kid who took care and protected his sister. That was why she was so pristine by the time Khal Drogo saw her. It's because of Viserys and because of the way he treated Daenerys and protected her, even though he became a dick at the end. In the beginning, because of what he did and how he protected her, and him marrying her to Khal Drogo, which got her the dragon eggs, I'm gonna go ahead and put him as a C tier. You know what? That's too high. I'm gonna put him right here on the first one. He's one of the better scumbag Targaryens, so he has a place in my heart for protecting Daenerys. And now we have Daenerys Stormborn, the Dragon Queen herself, the Mother of Dragon, Khaleesi, the Misa, the Breaker of Chains. Daenerys is everything that Aegon Targaryen was in female form. So she should be an S class, but she's not. She's an A. And that's because of the show. The way the show did her character so dirty in the final season, it held her back from being Aegon incarnate. And the House of the Dragons is trying to save it. She may be the prince that was promised. If she is, she's an S tier. But until then, she's an A tier. But she's recreating Aegon's footsteps. She's coming to Westeros with 3 dragons to unite the kingdoms. While she doesn't have sister wives, she has many lovers. And she is a conqueror. She went all through Essos and conquered so many of the free cities, freed so many slaves. Everything that made Aegon the greatest Targaryen ever is running through Daenerys' veins, except for the fact that she doesn't have kids yet. She almost had one, but it was some deformed dragon thing that doesn't count. And that's another reason she can't be S-class. But if she is the prince that was promised, she deserves to be up there. You know what? I'm going to put her ahead of Daemon. She is the closest thing to Aegon the Conqueror that you can get to in House Targaryen. And we're not going to talk about Jon Snow but guys, that's just my thoughts about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section below. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and until next time, peace.